Never overpromise and underdeliver is one of the most important maxims of sales. Yet according to University of Bath sociologist Pete Manning, this is precisely what happened with the extraordinary chambers of the courts of Cambodia. The ECCC, as it is also known, was responsible for identifying and prosecuting the perpetrators of the 1.5 to 2 million lives lost during the Cambodian genocide. Anchored in Western understandings about traumatic memory applied wholesale to nations, Pete Manning argues that the ECCC made far-reaching claims about how transitional justice would help Cambodia heal and move towards a healthier future. These claims masked the very real international and domestic political constraints that limited the work of the court. They also failed to recognize how Cambodians might remember and make use of the past in ways that had little to do with Western assumptions. It was when Pete Manning first traveled to Cambodia over 20 years ago that he was struck by the gap between Western preconceptions and the reality of how Cambodians remembered the genocide.
Part of my curiosity started because of this sort of disconnect, as we're sort of describing it, or this discordance, I suppose. On the one hand, between the representation, the depiction of Cambodia as this basically sort of kind of like a backwater space, right? A sort of broken, dysfunctional, sort of amnesiac, politically corrupt space. All these sort of quite problematic, freighted assumptions about Cambodians, Khmer people's sort of inability to remember this violent history, or sort of the assumptions about a sort of culture of denial. And actually, people don't think and feel about the past like that, or they didn't think and feel about the past like that, even back then. It was striking because I'd have friends that would say things, quite. These were conversations, let's say, that just weren't perhaps visible to the Western eye in the way that you would sort of expect them to be. So mum saying things to their kids like, if you don't eat up all your rice, then the Pol Pots will come and get you. So memory was being reproduced, right? This violent history was being remembered, and at least it was being remembered in ways that were perhaps more complicated or more elusive than perhaps that sort of prevailing human rights discourse on the one hand and human rights scholarship on the one hand was able to grasp, and I suppose on the other, the way the guidebooks wanted to, depict Cambodia as a sort of tourist destination that was a bit Wild West, right? So that was my entry point, I suppose.
Pete Manning has spent years studying the relationship between memory, transitional justice, and the genocide in Cambodia. This is the basis of his book, Transitional Justice and Memory in Cambodia, Beyond the Extraordinary Chambers. Pete Manning, welcome to Realms of Memory.
Thank you for having me on, Rick.
One of the lenses that you try to look through to understand memory and justice in Cambodia is you use Foucault and you use his ideas about discourse. And is it fair to say that if there's a language and a way of thinking, at least from the outside, about how the people in Cambodia experience that past or how they remember it, that those are just discourses, that's a language that comes from someplace else? It comes from other entities or other institutions that have their own agendas.
Yeah, I think, if I can sort of unpack it a little bit, I suppose, because Foucault's guilty of lots of sort of Eurocentric assumptions and problems. I don't want to get sort of too distracted by that. And, if I could just point out, I suppose, or just, make a gentle observation, I think it's useful to think about memory via Foucault, because in these contexts in particular, around sort of responses to violent pasts, in particular, because, his work is fundamentally concerned with a relationship between power and knowledge, right? That's the sort of typical or the classic relation that sort of people orientate or gravitate towards when they're reading Foucault. And, that critique, that's at work across Foucault's writing and thinking, really helps us sort of problematize the idea that to remember is a neutral process, right? That memory is sort of innocent, or that to remember has got a sort of like an automatic relation to sort of social and political betterment in the present. You remember to make things better. And what Foucault's work, exactly as you say, picking up on the idea that memory might be discursive, there might be discourses that lay claim over memory, seek to act on and intervene on memory. In doing so, they sort of enable certain people to sort of make those interventions in particular ways. There's a politics to all of this, right? There's a set of power relations at work in all of this. So, for me, I mean, I read Foucault, I suppose, in two sort of maybe slightly clumsy ways. I mean, the first is thinking about the sort of content of memory as discursive, and in that I just mean the stories of what is and is not remembered. We'll have ellipses, we'll have gaps, we'll have omissions. There will be erasures, and there's this sort of discursive ordering and architecture to that sort of sense of storytelling, I suppose. And then, in the second way, Foucault is very relevant, and this is very obviously sort of linked to his work that explicitly addresses questions of memory, I suppose, and psychoanalysis. His interest in histories of mental health and psychiatric intervention. Memory is an object of work. Memory is something that certain people are licensed to act on and intervene on in the name of certain claims for social progress and social betterment. And the techniques of memory that are at work in Cambodia, I mean, invariably are quite often rooted in quite limited and Eurocentric assumptions about trauma, for example, and the benefits of sort of therapy and therapeutic thinking for intervening on past violence, and I don't think they necessarily tell all the story.
One of the main things you're looking at here is this connection between transitional justice and memory, and there are these assumptions about the health-related dimensions of memory that apply to individuals, but then you can also apply them to nations, and they have their own history. And I guess if you go back to the idea of Foucault, they're institutions, they're entities that define how we understand memory, that are at the root of the authority of those institutions or disciplines, and a lot of those ideas about memory that are time and discipline specific just get incorporated into transitional justice and become the justification for intervention in places like Cambodia and elsewhere. Where do these ideas about memory and healing? And I thought this was fascinating because
yes. So I mean, it's a fascinating question. There's, I think, quite a lot going on in terms of the what you would need to sort of to really furnish a genealogy of the role of sort of therapeutic idioms. I think because that's fundamentally, I think, what this is about, and the way that they've sort of leached almost to become just a taken for granted set of shibboleths, essentially, that really order the most fundamental and basic assumptions about work in human rights and transitional justice. And in that respect, Foucault's work is important again because he wants us to pay attention to what he would describe as the sort of savoir, the grammar, the sort of grammatical knowledge, the basic sort of organizing principles of these realms of social and political action. And I suppose just a few quick observations would be, firstly, yes, I think this is rooted in a very specific Western European psychiatric history. And what's interesting there is the mobility of those assumptions about memory, and exactly as you picked up on, Rick, how they start in the first instance as a set of quite individualized and individualizing sets of claims about sort of individual capacities to remember and how the memory or the mind and the psyche will work, and they essentially became inflated, right, and applied wholesale to the body politic of nation states. Now that has got all sorts of problematic consequences and effects in the way that it sort of pathologizes these contexts. And it goes back to the point I was making previously about the sort of the rendering of Cambodia as this broken and politically sort of dysfunctional space, or its depiction at least on those terms. And exactly as you picked up, Rick, this is connected again to foregrounding certain agents and certain experts as able to sort of intervene within these spaces, and licensed authorities that can act to make these experiences better, or apparently to make these experiences better.
And I think one of the points you made is, well, if you want to trace the roots, at least some of the roots of the genocide, it goes back in part to the war in Vietnam, and there's bombings, the American bombings of Viet Cong in Cambodia. They're using Cambodia as a staging ground for the war in South Vietnam. And that's a destabilizing factor for the government. But the point of this is that there's a broader context, right? And one of the points that you make is that if you have this idea of transitional justice, that based on these therapeutic ideas of memory, that this is a wounded country, it's got this horrific past that it needs to deal with, and all of that is. All of that ends up being limited in time and focus, right? You have this conflict that really has much broader origins. It involves lots of different groups and a history that goes beyond the genocide that don't end up even getting included in the process of transitional justice. That the whole focus is very narrow and limited. And that's something I was hoping you could talk about, that you have this horrific event and it is possible to limit it in time. It's in 1975 to 1979, but it's not really just that there's more going on and there are more people involved. So, and I think that's one of the things you point out. That's one of the problems with transitional justice, is that it ends up being it makes broad claims, but it ends up being very narrowly focused.
That's absolutely right. I think what's key here is to bear in mind that the transitional justice is not inevitable. These mechanisms don't pop out of thin air, and the way that they are mandated to redress these kinds of violent histories will always be shaped by not just international political pressures, but domestic ones too. So, in Cambodia, I mean, of course, we've not, whilst you have a handful of senior leaders who were or would be put on trial at the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia, that transitional justice process in no way was going to look at, for example, the US bombing in the years prior to the rise of the Khmer Rouge. And by some estimates, that bombing campaign killed upwards of 500,000 civilians, right? It was illegal, even according to US law, right? As it was sort of executed in 1973, a period of 1973. Similarly, you're not going to have transitional justice efforts that look at what happened after the Khmer Rouge were removed from power. The sponsorship of the Khmer Rouge by China, other Western governments, and this is a period where they were continuing to commit quite terrible sort of violence against civilian groups, particularly sort of ethnic minorities, still throughout the 1980s and 1990s. So you're absolutely right. Transitional justice, even as it wants to sort of call attention to some episodes of conflict and atrocity, it's productive of its own elisions as well. It's essentially sort of attenuating any scrutiny of crimes and histories that were perpetrated by powerful actors, the US in particular, China as well. Of course, there's a domestic politics to all of this as well. So, within Cambodia, there was the reconciliatory, politics of the 1980s and 1990s. Was really, hinged upon bringing lower level Khmer Rouge back into the fold. So essentially, sort of after the Khmer Rouge were removed from power in 1979, you have a very protracted civil war that goes on for 20 years, and the government essentially had to buy off lower level Khmer Rouge, and the way that they were doing this is essentially by granting de facto amnesties. So throughout the transitional justice process, around the ECCC, but then also in lots of the work that other NGOs have been doing, you what's a real sort of hallmark of it all has been this idea that the senior leadership of the Khmer Rouge were to blame, which is ultimately sort of a sort of crafting and framing of responsibility that's actually quite common in international criminal law context. The idea that it's senior leaders sort of command responsibility. That's where the sort of the focus of redress efforts have got to fall. And in Cambodia, this has gone hand in hand with essentially the sort of an articulation of lower level Khmer Rouge quite often as victims as well of the regime. So quite often you'll have, around the ECCC process, you had a lot of quite explicit reassurance work going on, saying lower level Khmer Rouge had nothing to fear, for example, and an emphasis on the fact that lots of lower level Khmer Rouge were victimised as well, right? They lost relatives or witnessed things or were bystanders to things that perhaps they had not so much control over, let's say that. So those are the interesting sort of gaps, I suppose, that I would highlight in the work that's gone on within Cambodia. And on the international side, there's a lot of impunity, and domestically as well. People would argue, or some people would argue, that there's quite a lot of impunity too, because mid-ranking and lower level guys who might still live, very immediately around people that suffered under their hands, these people will not be punished.
But it's not like the current government of Cambodia that initiates that invites this process of transitional justice. They're not hiding from this limited focus, limited scope. Those are the terms and conditions that they established to begin with, and they justify, right, in terms of that's the best way to bring about reconciliation. That if the focus of the justice mechanism is too broad, that they argue it's going to be too disruptive.
That's absolutely right, and this is a point that I think is misrepresented slightly in lots of these conversations about the transitional justice process in Cambodia. I mean, you have critics of the Cambodian government, and the Cambodian government has got an appalling human rights record. These are not the good guys, but the sort of very limited jurisdiction, personal jurisdiction, is become a bit of a beating stick. Where and a sort of a bit of a lightning rod, I suppose, for accusations of sort of corruption and domestic impunity. And I think for some critics of the government, that people would not have been happy with the transitional justice process unless it was visibly breaching the sort of acceptance of the Cambodian government around that sort of limited jurisdiction. Which I just find sort of slightly baffling. The consent for this process, exactly as you say, Rick, in terms of sort of the initial invitation from the Cambodian government in 1997 to initiate a war crimes tribunal process, was predicated on only a handful of leaders, former Khmer Rouge leaders, essentially being brought into the dock. And that was clear from the get-go. So the idea that sort of limited jurisdiction is the sort of central and key failing of the court, I think is wide of the mark.
The hypocrisy of the whole process is, on the one hand, you have this therapeutic language of you need to intervene because you have this wounded country and you've got to work through this difficult past that they haven't confronted, and this is the only way for the country to move on. But in reality, that you have all kinds of political agendas that are driving the process. Countries that don't want to have their histories connected to this in any way at all, so you wonder, the importance of, you have these broad claims that are being made about what this is going to do for the country, and then you have the reality of what's behind it. That you have, it seems to be it's inevitably setting everyone up for disappointment.
I think that's right. This was also an incredibly expensive process, and it took a long time. The tribunal started in 2006, and it really was driven in part by by a sort of a broader set of international tropes around, the urgency and the need for justice in this context, and to this is a maybe slightly sort of crude and clumsy argument, but to justify the expense, big claims were made. The sort of language that was mobilised to justify the tribunal process, setting the record straight, moving forward through justice, all of these sorts of slogans. I think it probably was always destined to inflate expectations and then probably disappoint them. I think what's really, really sort of problematic about this is that a lot of the same sort of organisations and actors who were very, very involved in the initiation of the process and the inflation of those expectations, the insistence on the importance of a tribunal process, were quite quick to sort of turn on it. They were the first to also sort of decry the findings and the outcomes of the tribunal process is sort of, almost second rate, and this is, again, tethered to arguably this problem around the limited jurisdiction, right? The idea that the Cambodian government were obstructing the tribunal process, and they did do that, but they did that on terms that were apparent from the get-go. So I suppose my question there is just what's the surprise?
And you argue that if you're going to understand what $300+ million, and then you have what is it, 3 convictions at the end of all of it, and then you explain that if you go through these actual trials, and there are only a handful of them, 4 altogether, that the ones that are most successful are the ones that fit into that political agenda, and they're ones that neatly serve the interests of, especially the government of Cambodia, and that's the first trial, and maybe to a certain extent, the 2 people that are still alive that get convicted in the second trial. So could you explain what makes the initial convictions, or especially the first trial, a lot easier, and then it becomes much more complicated, and there's more resistance, at least within Cambodia, to when it comes to the later trials? Yeah,
of course. Yeah. So the first trial was the most straightforward for several reasons. I mean, the first of which was just the focus of that trial was principally around the 12 Slang S21 crime site, right, which is a former extermination centre in Phnom Penh. And the sheer weight of sort of documentary evidence that was retrieved from that site as a sort of evidential base, it was just very, very clear. And the gentleman that was overseeing that site, Doik, was also not really a political sort of sensitivity for the Cambodian government. He wasn't quite a senior leader, and he fell under the jurisdiction as a sort of most responsible person, as it was described under the ECCC mandate. So in that sense, that first trial, it didn't really ruffle any feathers, and that sort of evidential weight was just so significant, I suppose. Now, the second set of trials, case 002, were more sensitive because they concerned the senior leadership, and in terms of the legal machinations that were at play around that second trial, it was more complicated, just because you're having to sort of draw a picture of sort of command responsibility, I suppose. What was described or what's called in the legal process joint criminal enterprise, where these senior figures were giving orders, and they were knowingly bringing about situations where where it was within it was foreseeable that violence was either occurring or was being directly ordered. But pinning down the sort of paper trails and the actual sort of evidence base there is just, by the scale of the crimes, much harder. So that's why that took a lot longer. Now it's a third set of cases, 003, where the real sort of accusations of political interference sort of pick up, and these were directed at a group of sort of not quite senior, more mid-ranking Khmer Rouge officials, mid-ranking senior Khmer Rouge officials, who the government essentially opposed the prosecutions of. And I don't think that's because they were particularly sort of, on board with the government, or particularly, clients of the government, so to speak. But certainly they were, the government, as a point of principle, I think was always going to refuse any sort of prosecution that started to impinge upon their sense of what the jurisdiction should be limited to. And those cases were essentially sort of shut down on behalf of the sort of the Cambodian co-prosecutors and co-investigating judges who just would not consider sort of pushing forward with those. And this was in the context of a tribunal that sort of is brought together by international and Cambodian staff. So you'd have an international prosecutor, an international co-investigating judge, and a Cambodian counterpart for each of those offices. So where there are loggerheads, or where those sort of persons are at loggerheads in the tribunal process, things just didn't go forward. And this all fed a broader narrative of political interference, political corruption, I suppose, and really led to that sort of sense of, or the accusation from some international human rights organisations, that the tribunal process was a sham.
But your point too is that these trials it's like a stage where you have these struggles over framing this past, struggles over competing memory claims is how you describe it, and so you've got to try to control the narrative of how this is remembered, and the accused are often trying to challenge the way that narrative is framed, and they can do it, you mentioned, in all kinds of different ways, by working through the narrative, by just rejecting it outright, by trying to broaden it. So you mentioned, and you look at the scripts of the actual cases as examples of counter discourses that are at work, challenging the dominant ways of framing this particular past. So how does that work?
Yeah, so you see this play out in sort of uneven ways across the cases that were heard at the tribunal. The first trial against Duik, which was it was wrapped up pretty quickly, and that was partly because of Duik's admissions of guilt. Essentially, he played along with the tribunal script, and he offered apologies. There are some people will still say that the apologies were poorly worded, or maybe not so sincere. But essentially, what you saw in that trial was a sort of a strategy of acquiescence, I suppose you would say, where Duik was really acquiescing and playing along to the preferred scripts of the prosecution. Now, in the second cases where the charges are brought against the senior leaders, it gets more complicated. And you see, I think, two things that really characterise what had, I suppose that's a sense of contested memory within the courtroom. And the first of which, I suppose, would be denial. And I use Stan Cohen's work here actually to try and think about this. Stan Cohen sort of describes denial in sort of three ways. The first is that you'll get literal denials, where somebody will say something just didn't happen. Then you'll get denials by interpretation, where certain forms of wording might just tweak and adjust the meaning that is attributed to events. And then you've got a sort of an implicatory denial, almost a denial by justification. And you see that play out in that second trial, also the second sets of trials quite often. Now, a final point on this is I think is quite interesting, because it goes back to this question of sort of hypocrisy that's haunting the Cambodian transitional justice process, or at least the legal side of it. Which is around sort of strategies of rupture that the accused actually mobilised. And this is ultimately sort of where those senior leaders, whether it be Khieu Samphan, more often actually Nguyen Chia, who was a very senior Khmer Rouge leader, essentially asked the question, who are you to judge? Where they can point the finger back at the courtroom and say, you're trying the crimes that the Khmer Rouge committed. But you are not trying. Who are you to judge when you are not trying at the same time? For example, the US bombing, or what happened afterwards, or various different sort of human rights violations that either preceded or followed the Khmer Rouge regime. So that sort of sense of questioning the integrity of the jurisdiction, questioning the integrity of the process, I think is fascinating. Just in terms of the way that it asks questions of memory and about the supposed universality of these processes. That all perpetrators of human rights violations apparently have to be punished when, quite easily the accused can say in the courtroom, well, they're not being.
And again, you're just revealing that the hypocrisy or the reality that this whole process is supposed to be objective and driven by the facts and inspired by these sciences of healing, but in reality, it's constrained, narrowly focused, and you have efforts to challenge and to reveal, what narratives are allowed, what aren't, and those that aren't often what gets silenced in some cases. I think you make a point too that the process allows for victims to have a voice, and even that gets constrained in certain ways.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So one of the innovations of the Cambodian tribunal process was quite a central role for victim participation. So you had in the second set of trials, case 002, the opportunity for some victims to testify about their experiences. And on the one hand, this is a really important sort of development within the wider landscape of international criminal justice. It's reflective of the increased sort of centrality of tropes about victimhood within transitional justice processes. But on the other, we've always got to ask that sort of set of more critical, cautionary questions, I think, and certainly on the way that those forms of participation were enabled or invited. There were constraints around what could and could not be said. So in the first instance, the fact that it's only a small number of victims that are given this platform out of a much broader universe of experiences, it is immediately going to limit the kinds of experience and testimony that are heard within the courtroom. But then beyond that, the actual sort of stories themselves had to conform to certain scripts. These victims had to demonstrate their suffering against the sort of almost the map of the evidence base and the investigation at hand, and they had to do so in certain ways. They had to sort of demonstrate their suffering in particular therapeutic terms, right? Particular therapeutic sort of idioms. And that sort of sense of sort of grievance where it has to be articulated on those terms, I think is also in turn quite limited and limiting.
Okay. And one of your points was that if you focus on the trials and you think about transitional justice just in terms of this court that's set up, that you miss out on how much broader the process is. And there are all kinds of non-governmental organizations that are supporting of the work of transitional justice, and they're part of the way in which this past is getting framed and understood and constrained. And you point out a couple entities in particular, the Documentation Center of Cambodia, and the one individual who's a driving force behind that, the Transcultural Psychosocial Organization. What's the role of these non-governmental organizations in the work of transitional justice and shaping memory? How does that work?
Yeah, so I think there's two things going on here. The first of which is that these organisations really pushed and advocated for the transitional justice process, and they had a big bearing on the shape and terms that transitional justice in Cambodia, even within the courtroom, sort of ended up looking like. These groups were very influential in supporting and sort of almost mobilizing, victims, collective sort of victims groups to advocate for and push for sort of reparations, for example. But really ultimately, what I'm trying to do with this argument is show that the courtroom itself, is only one quite small space within which the transitional justice process, I suppose, was playing out in Cambodia, at least. And it's quite telling because the tribunal process got a lot of public attention, I suppose, in the media, on TV and on radio at certain points. but lots of people didn't necessarily pay a great deal of attention to it, and ultimately sort of public awareness of the tribunal process remained fairly limited throughout. And in that respect, you can look at these sorts of organisations doing more sort of continuous work, I suppose, in terms of sort of public outreach and public education around the margins, and they're not marginal, but they were working on the margins to stretch and augment the transitional justice process in Cambodia. So there's two organisations that you mentioned there that I talk about in the book. The Documentation Centre of Cambodia. I mean, firstly, it's a hugely important organisation in terms of advocacy for and about memory in Cambodia. DCCAM was set up in the early 90s, really as an offshoot of Yale's Cambodian genocide program, and its initial sort of mandate was really around preserving archival materials and trying to sort of prefigure what would become the tribunal process by essentially collecting evidence. But their work has expanded beyond that, and that's partly down to the role of their executive director Yu Chang, who is he's a very charismatic guy. He's very. This is not a sort of cynical take. He's very good at sort of mobilizing and leveraging organizational support, for example, to secure sort of donor funding. He's very good at working with sort of international partners and other academics and researchers. And so DCCAM have really shifted beyond just that initial mandate of doing work to sort of collect an evidence base, I suppose, to a much broader suite of initiatives and interventions that are intended to sort of promote memory. So, for example, they were very influential in the initiation of a new public school history textbook, right, that was introduced in 2007. That's the history of democratic Kampuchea. Now, they do these things working within an environment that isn't necessarily always particularly welcoming, and so there's a politics there as well. So DCCAM, in the work they were doing and authoring this new textbook, obviously had to follow certain sort of parameters in terms of what could and could not be talked about, and so that question of sort of politics and memory is really apposite in these cases too. The same goes for TPO. This is again where I pay attention to this example because I want to show how that relationship between memory and politics is messy, but also quite implicit in the work of some of these organisations. So TPO do a lot of psychosocial work where they will go out to the provinces and try and raise awareness about trauma, for example. And there's been a real effort to sort of try and vernacularize that and express, or try to raise awareness about sort of mental health and mental well-being in and through idioms that are more immediately sort of accessible to a Cambodian audience. And even as they're doing this, I would suggest there's still a sort of politics at work there, and that's partly because when you frame these memories of these experiences again through these therapeutic and trauma vocabularies and idioms, you displace other ways of thinking about the past. And you mobilize forms of memory claim that have their own effects, right? When you talk about sort of groups of people as traumatized, you pathologize them. They tend to be sort of quite disempowered in their relationship to their experiences and their survivorship. And one of the effects of trauma, a trauma framing in that respect, as well as to sort of wish away questions of sort of retributive justice. So questions of sort of of retribution and revenge potentially sort of get located as pathologies themselves or unhealthy dispositions in regard to memory, and that fits that wider politics of national reconciliation that I was talking about previously, where lower level Khmer Rouge are sort of depicted as these co-victims, I suppose, of the regime. So that there's a sort of set of alignments and affinities there between the sort of the politics of memory and the framing of these sorts of interventions.
So I think the common theme is whether you're looking at this international court or you're looking at these NGOs, there's a simplification and a flattening of that past, how it's framed, how it's understood, and And then if you look at the actual memory sites, especially the most prominent ones, you briefly mentioned this S21 Tuol Sleng Museum of Genocide Crimes and the Killing Field Memorial, that you see the same, and even Wat Themi, you see the same kind of flattening and simplification of that past, that it's fit into like a neat black and white structure, and it supports the way, especially the way the government wants to shape that narrative. How does memory work in a flattening way at these different sites, prominent sites of memory?
Yeah, so there's some interesting work that goes on around representation at those principal memorial sites, and it's changed a lot. And S21, the museum staff in particular, have done a lot of good work in sort of complicating and adding a bit more sort of nuance, I suppose, to that representational work and the sort of histories that are communicated at those spaces. But they can never quite sort of escape the history of that site itself, which exactly as you say is quite flattening and is quite binaried in its depiction of Khmer Rouge violence. Again, it's this insistence that only the sort of Khmer Rouge leadership were to blame, and a broad sort of ellipsis and a broad sort of absence really of explanatory content around the role of lower level Khmer Rouge. That has changed slightly, where as I said previously, the lower level Khmer Rouge are increasingly sort of argued to be co-victims of the regime. But ultimately, it's within these parameters that does tend towards sort of more Manichaean oppositions between the sort of the evil of the leadership and the suffering of the Cambodian people more broadly. I mean, these spaces, I was quite keen during my fieldwork for the book to get away from Phnom Penh and get away from those more high profile commemorative sites. And that was why I did a little bit of work up in Siem Reap. Now there's provincial memorials across the country, but the Siem Reap Wat Mai memorial, I think, was quite interesting and quite illuminating in what it told us, because it reveals, I think, some of the pragmatisms I think that are at work in other Cambodian relationships to these histories that tend not to be recognised, within the transitional justice process, I suppose. And the Wat Mai site in particular is quite novel, because it picks up on lots of the iconography and the imagery, takes them sort of wholesale from S21, and then displays them as if it's sort of in situ authentic to that space, and it's not. So in the representational work that's going on at that particular site, they have to borrow from that broader sort of landscape of national imagery to sort of authenticate and present the work that's going on in that sort of local space. And within these local spaces, that you've got other sort of challenges of representations. There's still sort of display of human remains, and lots of Cambodian audiences find that quite problematic, because it's a sort of violation of Buddhist funerary practice, where an inauspicious death should oblige a really urgent cremation. And so the idea of having human remains still on display actually sort of is quite upsetting for some Cambodian audiences, and lots of the kids think that there are ghosts still at the site, right? Because where there's human remains, there will be spirits. So the sort of assumed relationships that people have to these memorial spaces, or ostensibly memorial spaces, don't really necessarily work in the way that we or Western audiences or human rights audiences more broadly might assume and expect. So you have to ask other questions about how these sites are made meaningful, and ultimately, in spaces like Wat Mai, the space serves other purposes. It has become a site that attracts tourists. There's busloads of people that visit the famous Angkor temples that have to stop off, or they tend to stop off and do a quick tour of that space on their way up to the temples, and they will put donations in a box. And those donations are used to maintain a pagoda, and the pagoda, has its own sort of functions in terms of the support and the role that it provides for the local community, whether that be in terms of sort of food or accommodation or schooling. And so, ultimately, that it's just a different set of relationships that might not be visible, I suppose, to the way that we would assume a memorial tethers or anchors a set of memories about past violence. And my argument in the book is that demonstrates a sort of a pragmatism, I think, that we should pay more attention to.
So you have an effort on the one hand to use these sites to flatten the past, to present a certain memory of what happened, but in the end, you can't really control how people relate to them, and they're going to understand them in their own way, right? Whether it's monks who are okay with tourists coming because the revenue is important, or people who just use it as a stopping off point or recreational space. So I think that's one of the contrasts, right, that you were trying to point out.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, ultimately, the argument, if there was one key argument that to come through in the book that I would want to sort of stress to readers, it's that sense of sort of variability in the relationships that people have to these experiences of past violence, and that there's a problem at work within transitional justice intervention, research and practice that assumes people will have quite uniform relationships to these experiences. And actually, it's okay to be, quite ambivalent, or to be pragmatic, or to be, even opportunist, right? In the way that these histories are made meaningful, and that really comes through in the relationship that people, adopted or were adopting in relation to those commemorative sites.
But it's really, I had an episode on the genocide in Rwanda, and I interviewed Tim Longman, and there are just so many parallels here that you frame that past. You really want to accentuate the horror so you can cast the government in a savior role, and that you've got to cast it in terms of a black and white past, and you erase a lot of the complexity in the process. So in Rwanda, you go to these mass grave site, mass memorials, and you have who knows whose bodies are there. They're basically collecting bodies from all sides and just burying them, and everybody gets labeled as victims of the genocide. To me, it seems like the very same thing is happening at places like S21 or Watheme. I know I'm mispronouncing that, but where who knows whose skulls are there. Those pictures that become emblematic of the genocide, they're all victims of the regime, but when you look more closely, really, they could have been participants. That this flattening of the past doesn't allow for the true complexity of the victims. One day could have been the perpetrators another day.
That's absolutely right. There's a very interesting history about the sort of the politics of anonymity and the politics of flattening, in all of that sort of representational work, So I suppose what you describe as a sort of an international iconography of the Cambodian genocide, those portrait photographs, those black and white photographs, that were taken as people were interred at the S21 site, they're exactly as you say, quite often images of women and children, victims of the regime, but they quite often also include members of the Khmer Rouge, lower level Khmer Rouge too. And in that period after the removal of the regime from 1979 onwards, lots of people went to go and look for missing relatives in those images, and the state throughout that period was always quite resistant to sort of naming those faces, and that is partly because there wasn't there was a resistance, I suppose, to recognizing that the lower level Khmer Rouge then were made up a significant number of those people.
And just the use of bodies too. There's this hypocrisy. On the one hand, you're trying to be sensitive to this horrific past and help people to move on, and yet there's this complete lack of sensitivity about putting these bodies on display, these bones on display. And the exact same thing happens in Rwanda. That's completely at odds with traditional practices and values and customs. But it's the political imperatives that override everything else.
That's absolutely right. So throughout the 1980s, there were commemorative activities around sites of mass graves, and in that period after the Khmer Rouge were removed from power, all of those graves were exhumed, and the remains were chemically treated, and they were displayed in boxes, and later in the 1980s, sometimes moved into stupas, in a way to communicate a message that could be not in any sense sort of equivocal about the past. It was a sort of a brutalism, in one dimensionality in this central claim that was, legitimating the Cambodian state in the 1980s. That essentially they were the saviors, right? They prevented and ended a genocide, and what more proof do you need than to see these masses of bones and bone fragments, skulls, human remains on public display in these boxes across the country. So that was a key sort of part of the state's self-legitimization strategy throughout that period in the 1980s and 1990s. And people still ask questions about why the bones, have not, to this day, have not been appropriately cremated. That question, I think, as and when it is returned to, I think will be quite an interesting point of potential resolution around how this case is remembered and thought about.
But it seems to be almost like a international marketing ploy that's pretty successful, because when you think about the genocide in Cambodia, those black and white photos and that S-21 camp, that does come to represent everything that happened. Right? So it does become a powerful visual.
It does, and it's also quite a key feature in the tourist economy, right? In Phnom Penh, and in other places, visiting S-21 and visiting the Chuang Ek killing fields, is part of the itinerary. If you spend time in Phnom Penh, you'll be held by various different tuk-tuk drivers throughout the day, and they will almost always ask you if you want to go and visit these two sites in particular. And so, that sort of question of sort of ownership and the role and function of these spaces, I think, is still quite vexed. There was a controversy a decade or so ago where the ticket concession to Chuang Ek, the killing field site in Phnom Penh, was actually sold to I believe it was a Japanese Korean concession. To a company who would essentially sort of act as a steward of this space, and promised to reinvest some money in the redevelopment of a sort of visitor centre. But the idea of sort of privatising or sort of commercialising or selling off a space that's ostensibly meant to be sort of dignifying of these histories and these experiences, it raises sort of interesting questions, I suppose, about ownership and about sovereignty and about the sort of ethics of memory that are at work around those spaces. So you can juxtapose that, I suppose, on the one hand with that sort of sense of pragmatism, I suppose, that I was outlining previously about Wat Tamai. I think they're sort of slightly different stories, I suppose. On the one hand, about how a community has renegotiated its relationship to those sorts of memorial site on its own terms, and then on the other hand, how we've probably got to be slightly cautious about the wholesale sort of commercialization and privatization of these kinds of spaces elsewhere in Phnom Penh, and the sorts of ethics, and politics that attend to that. Yeah,
I think another example of this that you offer is this commemorative event, the May 20th Day of Remembrance, and so what the performance that takes place, or performances that take place across the country, where they take place. It's a type of unusual reenactment. You point out a new invented tradition. How is this another example of this tension between memory and kind of an uncomfortable manipulation of these spaces?
Yeah, so the May the 20th commemoration is really interesting. It's changed quite a lot since it was first introduced in the 1980s. I mean, back in those initial sort of instantiations, it was community groups were essentially sort of invited by local authorities to go and testify their and perform their anger towards the Khmer Rouge at the burial sites, at the memorial sites, at the sites of mass graves. And it was an invented tradition. It was top down. It was very much directed by the state. But then I think at the same time, when Rachel Hughes's work is very interesting to read on this, and she's written about it sort of more extensively than I have. But one of the points she stresses is that this did still have some resonance, I suppose, for the kinds of popular and public sentiment that were at play in the 1980s. So even though it was sort of very much an invented tradition, it still sort of chimed through a little bit with the way that people were feeling in that period in the 1980s, and it was a public acknowledgement of the harms that had been suffered. So in that sense, it still tallied, I suppose, or clicked with the way people at that time were remembering what the Khmer Rouge had perpetrated against them. Now I contrast that slightly with what's happened more recently. So in Phnom Penh, at these two very high profile spaces at S21, but then at the killing fields as well, you've had much more carefully curated, let's say, performative and commemorative events. To the extent that in recent years they'd even included sort of almost like a battlefield reenactment of moments within the genocide, which is slightly odd because we'd normally sort of understand a sort of a battlefield reenactment as something that would happen around a conflict, right, a war, rather than something that you could possibly do in relation to a genocide. And so that was at the Chuang Ek site, where young students from the Royal University of Phnom Penh and the arts had to dress up essentially in black and then reenact, mass killings essentially on a lawn in front of the stupa and in front of all of these human remains. And then the narrative arc of the ceremony is it culminates with the sort of the Vietnamese and the government sort of intervention in 1979, where the state is portrayed as this liberating and a saviour force that ends that genocidal violence. But the point I'm making is that it's an odd sort of aesthetic. It's an odd sort of kitsch. The idea that you could even think to demonstrate or to display or reenact that kind of violence as if it has any value as, I suppose, art. In the context of a site where human remains are still on display. It grates. It sits perhaps slightly uneasily, I suppose, with the way that we would assume people engage with those sorts of spaces and sites.
So, if you look at the limitations of this international court, these performances, these sites of memory, the work of these NGOs. All trying to deal with this particular horrific past. I mean, is there any kind of corrective? Is there any right way of doing this, or is this just an impossible mission?
So I think part of the problem is a set of inflated expectations about what these processes can deliver that is then necessarily always going to be disappointed. Now I say that, going back to the point I made previously, which was that you had a big push amongst transitional justice organisations, human rights organisations, to initiate the tribunal process, and to do that, big promises were made. The scope, the scale, the kind of justice that was promised, was probably invariably always never going to be delivered on that basis. Now I say that, and I think ultimately, I want to recognise at the same time that the tribunal engaged communities in quite uneven ways. Some people really have bought into this process. They've really taken a lot from it, and they value the verdicts and the findings. Other people have been hugely disappointed, and other people just haven't paid any attention to it. So it's always where this sort of ends up as either a success or a failure is always going to be, I think, quite messy. Now, what I would, I think, point to, I suppose, as successes or victories within all of this is probably around some of that work that has gone on and been led by civil society groups. And it's not innocent. There's lots of there's lots of sort of interesting politics and problems that attend to that practice too. But they've made great strides in pushing and augmenting, the shape of what transitional justice looks like now. So, for example, there's a big push among those groups now to engage in questions around intergenerational dialogue. And by that, what we're getting at is in Cambodia, this is violence that happened in the 1970s. Lots of elderly Cambodians that experienced this firsthand, have children or grandchildren who don't necessarily believe them when they talk about this. So that sort of absence or questions around the authenticity of these sorts of histories, the veracity of these sorts of histories, that's something that these non-governmental organisations are really trying to pick up on now. Really trying to engage young people in conversations and debates about the value of learning about this past, and the value of sort of remembering the experiences of their relatives. And I think in that respect, that's work that's going on not just in the public school curriculum, but in other educational spaces and in lots of other more creative fields. In film, in arts work, arts-led advocacy, and it's addressing these questions with more nuance than I think the sort of the courtroom could perhaps allow for.
Pete Manning, thank you so much for taking time to talk to me today. I really appreciate your perspective.
Thank you so much, Rick.
Pete Manning is Senior Lecturer in Sociology in the Department of Social and Policy Sciences at the University of Bath. I've been talking with him today about his book, Transitional Justice and Memory in Cambodia, Beyond the Extraordinary Chambers. After traveling the globe for the past 2 years, I'll return home next month for the first of several episodes on the United States. I'll start by talking with University of Oklahoma professor Carlos K. Hill about his book, Beyond the Rope, The Impact of Lynching on Black Memory and Culture. Carlos argues that representations of lynched black bodies were never static. It was the framing of black bodies in threatening and demeaning ways that fueled the lynching epidemic that claimed thousands of African American lives beginning in the late 19th century. But it was also the efforts of African American cultural and political actors to offer their own, more humanized and even heroic representations of lynched black bodies that were instrumental in challenging this American reign of terror. If you find value in the work featured in Realms of Memory, you can support us by telling a friend or posting a review on your favorite podcast platform. I'm Rick Dadarian. Thanks for listening, and see you soon.